Good afternoon, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore, located in Decatur, Georgia. We are really excited to see all of you from around the world tuning in to celebrate Fermentation is for Everybody, our special event with two of our favorite fermenters, Julia Skinner and Sandor Katz. We have been fans of both of these folks for a long time. We have known Sandor's work for many, many years because Sandor is really the person who taught us the most about fermentation of any author, any person. He's done more to kind of teach the world about fermentation, especially in the United States, and especially folks in the South. And we're very lucky to have Julia Skinner located right here in Atlanta, Georgia. So Julia is the founder of Root Kitchens, Atlanta's fermentation and food history company, offering online classes, consulting for creative professionals, private lessons, and more. She's also a food writer driven by curiosity and her love of history, and these interests, along with her skills as a visual artist, led her to create The Hidden Cosmos, a fermentation oracle and recipe deck, which, if y'all have not looked at this yet, I finally got to actually touch it in my own hands on Friday, and it is beautiful. The art is beautiful. The concept is beautiful. The design is awesome. You are going to want this deck. Her next book, Our Fermented Lives, comes out this summer. It's available for pre-order now from Charis. You can follow along with Julia on social media at Root Kitchens or at Bookish Julia or through her newsletter, which we'll drop a link for in the chat. And she's joined today by Sandor Ellix Katz, who is a fermentation revivalist, a self-taught experimentalist who lives in rural Tennessee. His explorations in fermentation developed out of his overlapping interests in cooking, nutrition, and gardening. He is the author of 5 books, including Wild Fermentation, The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved, The Art of Fermentation, which was a New York Times bestseller and winner of a James Beard Foundation Award, Fermentation as Metaphor, and his latest, Fermentation Journeys, all of which are available from Charis now. His books and the hundreds of fermentation workshops he has taught around the world have helped catalyze a broad revival of the fermentation arts. The New York Times calls Sandor one of the unlikely rock stars of the American food scene. And for more information, you can check out his website, which is wildfermentation.com, and I'll drop that in the chat as well. So, thank you to everyone who's watching. We want to encourage you to ask questions. You can put them in the chat or you can put them in this ask a question box, and we'll be sure to try and work those in. But thank you, Julia and Sandor, for being here. It is a real delight to have both of you here. I'm going to get out of the way and let y'all do your stuff.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, Julia, it's wonderful to see you.
Yay!
Hey, I actually have my Hidden Cosmos deck right here, and I thought, you know, it might be fun just to start by drawing a card.
Yeah, let's do it.
So I just mixed them up a little bit, and let's see. I got a 14, which I think is the jar. Yes, the jar. The jar is an empty vessel from which emerges endless possibilities. Within it, your culinary projects can begin to take root and take shape. This card is a sign that you're at a new beginning with a jar of endless potential to fill. The possibilities are yours to make. Okay, I'll take it.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
I got Brine, which is this little pickle lady.
Okay.
Brine is the core substance through which our lacto-fermented foods are possible. It creates an environment that fosters healthy fermentation while keeping out the bad stuff. Think about your core values and beliefs. How do they foster your creative unfolding?
Okay, I'm going to have a little bit of a sip of brine just because, you know, the card suggests it. This is radish kraut brine juice.
Ooh. That sounds really good.
Oh my God, so sour, so good. Okay, I know it's not available yet for people, but I have had the, the good fortune to get to read your forthcoming book, which is in production, which I wrote a foreword to and got to read. So I don't know, you want to tell people, like, give a little teaser about what your forthcoming book is all about?
Yeah. So it's called Our Fermented Lives, and it's all about all of the different ways that fermentation has intersected with human history. I mean, for all of human history. I mean, both from evolutionarily, kind of how our bodies developed and our coevolution with these microbes, all the way up to preserving food, to, you know, sharing fermented beverages at parties, to, you know, all kinds of different things. And so it's, you know, it's not a complete encyclopedia of all of that, because that would be giant, but it's touches on all of those themes and uses examples from all over the world. And I mean, I think that's a good segue to talk about your book.
Well,
What?
Great. I was just going to say I really enjoyed it, and you know, I think that you know, I don't know that it's necessarily for people who like don't know that they're interested in fermentation yet, but I mean, for anyone who's been exploring this realm of fermentation, I think it'll be a really, really you know, gratifying and fun and interesting and informative read. So so thank you, and I look forward to its emergence into the world.
Yeah, me too. They're at the printer right now, so for the advanced copies, so hopefully soon. But yeah, I mean, speaking of kind of stuff around the world, why don't we talk about your book a little bit? As you said,
okay, I can do that.
Yeah. Well, good. So yeah, tell me about it.
Did you have a specific question, or you just want me to like?
Yeah, maybe like for folks who haven't read it, just maybe a little bit of an overview.
Okay, so let me talk about like the genesis of this book. So this book, I call it Fermentation Journeys, even though the official name is Sandor Katz's Fermentation Journeys, but for me it's just Fermentation Journeys. And you know, this is about foods and beverages that I've learned about in my travels, and I have had, you know, just the incredibly good fortune to have had the opportunity to teach in a lot of different places. And you know, I really fell into fermentation. You know, I have no formal background. I never went to culinary school. I didn't study microbiology. I didn't study food science. You know, I love to cook. I've always loved to cook. I've always loved food. You know, as a kid growing up in New York City, I loved pickles. Like, that was a reputation I had in my family. Like, if the pickles all disappeared from the refrigerator, I'm probably the one who ate them. And I was just drawn to the flavor of pickles. Now, you know, pickles can be a lot of different things. The pickle's anything preserved in an acidic medium. But, you know, my grandparents were immigrants to New York from what is now Belarus. And, you know, we had the Eastern European style, what in New York we call sour pickles. Outside of New York, I see them called kosher dills. But, you know, they're basically, you know, cucumbers fermented in a brine. And as a kid, I didn't know that. But I was just drawn to the flavor that I now recognize as the flavor of lactic acid. There really is a distinctive flavor that those pickles have, and it's a flavor that sauerkraut has, and that lots of different fermented foods and beverages have. You know, in my mid-20s, I spent a couple of years following a macrobiotic diet, which places an emphasis on the digestive benefit of pickles and other live ferments. And I started noticing that these pickles that I had been eating my entire life, whenever I would eat them, I could feel the salivary glands under my tongue, you know, squirting out saliva. And I began to associate these pickles and other live fermented foods, you know, with literally getting my digestive juices flowing. But I still, you know, as long as I lived in New York, it was like easy for me to buy, and I never really thought about learning to make it myself. But, you know, almost 30 years ago, I moved from New York to a community in rural Tennessee. And one of the things that changed in my life is I started gardening. That was really one of the, you know, sort of reasons why I moved down here. I felt the call of plants and wanting to, you know, become more intimately acquainted with plants and learn how to grow plants and learn how to grow some food. And the first season I was gardening, We had a really nice bed of cabbages. And, you know, I was such a naive city kid. I've never even thought about the idea that in a garden, all of the cabbage would be ready at the same time. So, you know, the first year that I was faced with this, you know, a light bulb went off in my head. Hey, I think sauerkraut has something to do with preserving cabbage. I looked in the Joy of Cooking, and I learned how to make sauerkraut from the Joy of Cooking, and I couldn't believe how straightforward it was. I couldn't believe how delicious it was, how good it made me feel. And then I just started playing around with it. Well, what happens if I use turnips instead of cabbages? What happens if I add carrots to it? You know, what if I try a different kind of a seasoning? Oh, hey, how do you make yogurt? Oh, country wine. I'm going to try making wine with elderberries or blackberries. And, you know, I just sort of went down the rabbit hole of fermentation slowly. A friend started calling me Sandor Kraut. I got a reputation. Some friends of mine invited me in 1998 to teach a sauerkraut making workshop at their event here in Tennessee. It's the Sequatchie Valley Institute. It was called Food for Life. And that became an annual event, 1998, 99, 2000. 2001, I had a conflict. I couldn't make it to Food for Life. I wasn't able to teach my annual sauerkraut making workshop. So instead, I spent a month writing a tiny little self-published pamphlet, Wild Fermentation. This is the first iteration. But as soon as I was writing that, I was like, oh, this is interesting. I have a lot to say. I have a lot to learn. And so that became Wild Fermentation, and I found Chelsea Green, and they published it. But I organized a kind of extensive cross-country book tour. And, you know, my book tour never ended. And you know, now it's, you know, 20 years later. And, you know, I'm still an itinerant fermentation educator. But, you know, as time went on, I got invited to further and further away places. And at this point, I've had the opportunity to teach in maybe 25 countries. And when I go to places to teach, I don't only teach. I eat, I drink, I learn. Often my hosts take me to really special places to see unique things and learn unique things. So anyway, for years I've been thinking I was going to write this book about foods I've learned about in my travels because I've learned about so many of them. But, you know, I always had I always had a busy schedule and trips I was planning to make. So, you know, really it was because of the, you know, disruption in my life, like all of our lives of COVID, that, you know, all my plans got canceled. And, you know, I decided to write this book. So that's the story of this book. I started the project organizing it geographically. So it was good, you know, this was my trip to China. This is what I learned about. This is my trip to Colombia. This is what I learned about. But, you know, as the project went forward, I realized that, like, it would be much more powerful to organize it thematically and sort of compare and contrast, you know, how people in different parts of the world ferment similar, you know, kinds of foods. And so that's the sort of topical organization that emerged in the project.
Yeah, I like what you say about organizing thematically, because I actually did the same thing with my book. I started out being like, oh, let's talk about the history of fermentation, you know, in this area and this area. But of course, it's all so interconnected that didn't really make a lot of sense at all. I mean, are there any, when you think about the themes that you covered in this book, are there any that really stick out to you as being, I don't know, perhaps most common or that are most memorable for you in your travels?
Well, I mean, you know, in terms of what's common, I mean, I think that, you know, we have to recognize that, like, you know, what people ferment is whatever food resources are abundantly available in their environment. So, you know, in different kinds of environments, people have different kinds of food resources that are abundant. And generally, people are not fermenting, you know, the things that are most rare and most precious. They're fermenting the things that they have more than enough of in the period when they're abundant to get them through the period where there's less abundance. So, you know, that's the typical pattern with fermentation. And, you know, I think sometimes people imagine that fermentation is like a, you know, like a finite set of techniques. But, you know, in reality, it's very like disparate range of practices that, you know, I think only began to be conceptually unified with the emergence of microbiology and the recognition that all of these disparate processes, involve processes of microbial transformation, which we could then, sort of categorize by different types of microorganisms. So, one of my very strongest interests is in Bacillus subtilis, which is a very common soil bacteria. And there's a Japanese ferment that probably many people here have heard of, which is natto. It's a Japanese ferment of whole soybeans that a lot of people who have not been sort of, raised eating natto find very challenging. Bacillus subtilis produces an alkaline byproduct, so it has a little bit of a whiff of ammonia. Not unlike brie cheese or camembert cheese or certain other cheeses. I mean, there are actually quite a few these alkaline byproducts as part of them. But the way that it's used in Japanese cuisine fresh, it's got a mucilaginous kind of slimy coating on the beans, which a lot of people who are not accustomed to it find challenging. But I mean, personally, I love slimy foods. I mean, I'm the one who will just sit and eat okra raw. And, I'm not put off by that at all. And I have come to just like adore natto. But in my travels, what I have learned is that most other places that eat natto-like foods typically dry it and use it as a seasoning in cooking rather than a food that you directly eat. And I'm just going to reach over to grab something, but this is something that I've been making and eating in my kitchen. We call this special sauce. We just made this a couple of days ago, a fresh batch. But this is natto dehydrated and then ground up with roasted sesames and a little bit of salt. And sometimes we make it with other kinds of seasoning blends. I saw that my friend Soiree is on here. Soiree's made it with great other kinds of seasonings. And I'll tell you that, from sharing natto with a lot of people, people who, some people take to natto right away. Some people are extremely squeamish about it. I have yet to, show this to anyone, share a taste of this with anyone who doesn't love it. And I think that, dehydrating it, mixing it with some other things, and grinding it up makes it much more acceptable as a flavor. And, this has just extraordinary nutritional benefits, extraordinary flavor. So, this is something I'm super excited about, and a theme that I was super excited to be able to explore in the book. And yeah.
I love that. I mean, I love too how that touches on how versatile fermentation is. I mean, how I think that's one of like the great things when we think about not only is this the transformative action of microbes, but we're able to transform what we end up making into a number of different ways, like your powdered natto. Like I have a lot of ferments that I'll make that, let's say I make sauerkraut that has good flavor, but it's not as crisp as I want, and I'll dehydrate it, mix it up in a soup or something. It's, yeah, I love that. What else? Is there other, like anything else about this particular book that you really want people to know, like that you're just so excited about sharing?
Well, yeah, I mean, honestly, there's a lot of things in it. So, one of the like really, almost all the places that I've traveled in the last 20 years, I've gone to because I was invited to teach. And, if I can manage to go the next 10 days without getting COVID, I'm going to Iceland and the Faroe Islands, and I'll be teaching in the Faroe Islands, which I'm, just incredibly thrilled about. But the one place that I really went on, let's call it a pilgrimage to try to learn about fermentation is China. And I went with a Chinese American friend of mine, Mara Jane King, who grew up in Hong Kong, and then her mother, who's lived her whole life in Hong Kong, basically took us to this village that she's been visiting for years and where she has all these friends, it's, nearly a subsistence village, and people do just an incredible amount of fermentation there. But, the reason why I felt so drawn to visiting China and trying to learn about fermentation traditions there is, well, I mean, China is, one of the places in the world that just has, the most, incredible, range and variety of different fermentation practices. But my gateway into fermentation was sauerkraut. This is radish kraut that I made like 50 gallons of in November that I've been eating and sharing with friends. This is a jar of sauerkraut that I just made in a demo online the other day. That I haven't eaten yet, but in another week or two it'll be ready to eat. But all the historical sources that I've ever seen referring to the history of sauerkraut talk about China, and that the nomadic peoples of Central Asia had witnessed Chinese methods of preserving vegetables under a brine, and sort of brought that idea westward towards Europe, and that sauerkraut is really derived from Chinese traditions that are different. So, I mean, I've, in the book, I include, a lot of, different interesting things that I learned about fermenting in China. But the one that I've been making most frequently is what's called pao cai, which is a Chinese style of fermenting vegetables in a spiced brine. So, this brine has, ginger and Sichuan peppercorns and star anise and chili peppers, and I put a little bit of licorice in it. But it's a perpetual brine that I keep on putting vegetables in, taking them out and eating them, putting more vegetables in, taking them out and eating them. And then, over time, salt migrates out with the vegetables, so I have to add a little bit more salt. I mean, this has been going for a couple of years now, so, I'll add more seasonings to it. But this is really like a wonderful thing. And it's not exactly the same as sauerkraut, but, to me, it's in the larger, vegetable fermentation family. And as much as I love the incredible variety of ferments, this is my everyday go-to. What I try to sort of eat with almost everything else that I eat, is some form of fermented vegetables. So, it's really fun for me, just in a sort of culinary variety sense, to have like several different styles of fermented vegetables, that I can, rotate.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about your trip with Mara too, I also want to encourage people to check out the People's Republic of Fermentation, the video series you did. The book talks about that as well, and talks about a lot of things from this trip. But that video series, I think, really helps people understand that journey a bit more and see a little more in depth there too.
Yeah, so let me tell people what People's Republic of Ferment. I'm just writing it into the chat here. But it's a series of 8 videos, roughly 10 minutes each exploring a different, type of fermentation that we learned about on our trip. And it has recipes, but it also has a lot of really fun video footage from our trip. And one explores pao cai, one explores doubanjiang, which is this wonderful Sichuanese paste of chili peppers and fava beans, and which is I also have a recipe in Fermentation Journeys for that. Rice alcohol, I've been making this Chinese style of rice alcohol, miju, which is really, really approachable and straightforward. I make these and we have an episode about that. We have an episode about methods we learned about in this village Qinfen in Guizhou for fermenting fish and pork in a spiced rice medium. And that's another theme I explore in the book, because really throughout Asia, people are using rice as a medium for fermenting fish and meat. And one thing that's become a real regular part of my repertoire is nem, which is a Thai style of fermenting ribs. in a paste of rice, garlic, and salt. I also have some recipes for narazushi, which is sort of an old style of sushi in which fish is fermented in a bed of rice. So that's another, like, very, very interesting theme to me that I've got to explore in this book in a thematic way.
Yeah. And I mean, it's such a fun book. Like I really have loved going through it and reading it and kind of remembering the different times that we've talked about different ferments or made them together. And you've referenced these moments that you, from your travels, when you learned to make, say, pao sai, or something like that. And yeah, it's like, it's fun to kind of, like, you feel very much like you're kind of walking down this, I don't know, memory lane sounds a little, that sort of thing with you. And it feels really, really special. And I wonder if you could really quick.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't think it's bad to call it memory lane. I mean, that's something profound about food, is how, how memories are associated with it. I mean, there's certain foods, just like I think about my grandmother, like I can't help it. There are things that she made or things that she taught me how to make, and just like whether I'm making it or I'm encountering it that somebody else made, it just makes me think of her. And so same thing, like, certain ferments that I first learned about on a trip, if I see that ferment or read about that ferment, I'll start, thinking about, my host there was so wonderful. I wonder how they're doing. And, I mean, all these things have, they have associations, and, they're food, they're sustenance, but, they're also that they end up, sort of embodying memories. And, certainly this book is part travelogue, and, stories of, places I visited and people I met, and, hosts I spent time with, and stuff like that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. 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 And it's, I think, especially with these traditional foods like this, I mean, it's like it's our memories, but then, so many people have memories attached to these foods because they've been around for so long and they're such a part of all of our cultures. And even foods we're not that familiar with. I remember when I was in Iceland last year, I had fermented shark for the first time, and it kind of has that alkaline sort of flavor too. And I was like, oh, this kind of tastes like, these cheeses or natto, like, like how you were talking about earlier. Like it has that memory associated with it, even if it's a memory of like a connected but not the same thing, like a similar taste. Have you found anything like that? Like any, yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing that just brought to mind is, the idea that, so many of the flavors of fermentation are what we might call acquired taste. And, they're not necessarily like, like a sweet flavor that, like, we sort of have an ingrained attraction to. And so, I've been thinking a lot about, the process of acquiring the taste for different foods. And, what I've realized for myself is that, a lot of my willingness to give a food that I'm not like initially drawn to a second chance or a third chance is really the process of watching other people take pleasure in them. When I was just thinking about the idea that, like, the cheeses that I get excited about at this point in my life, almost all of them as a kid, I just would have been really disgusted by them. But, the thing that made me give them another chance and another chance was just like seeing how excited people got and how, how much pleasure people were taking in them. And, even something like beer, like, I don't know of anyone who the first time they tasted beer liked the flavor of beer, but, you keep on trying because you see how much the people who like it. Coffee, I mean, I wasn't really, I didn't really like coffee till I was in my mid-20s, but like, I saw how much, people loved it. You know, I think that there's you know, a lot to that.
Yeah. Yeah, the coffee thing is interesting. I was actually the only kid I know or knew who actually liked coffee. Every time we'd go to the grocery store, I would insist that my mom get me coffee flavored yogurt because I wasn't allowed to have coffee. So I would have my coffee yogurt instead. And yeah, I loved it. I mean, I wanted to have coffee from God when I was like probably 4 years old or something is when I just decided that that was the thing I wanted to have all the time.
Funny.
But yeah, I mean,
I see that someone asked a question.
Yeah.
That seems like an interesting question. Raju Singh asks, I'm curious about the author's opinion about the differences and benefits between live cultures versus dead cultures. I've heard various critiques, but still unsure about this.
Hello. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go?
Why don't you go?
Okay. So, I mean, I think the nice thing about ferments is that, like, eating the live culture, it is beneficial for you. Of course, you're giving yourself probiotic food that has all kinds of health benefits for digestion and immunity and all these other good things. But cooking with the food, I mean, yes, it will kill the bacteria, but that's also fine. I mean, there's no reason you can't enjoy both of them. I just was reading a post that another one of our friends put on Instagram a few hours ago about, like, it's okay to eat your ferments, you know, both raw and cooked. Like, you can enjoy them in multiple ways. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question. I mean, both do have health benefits. Of course, only the living ones, the raw ones, are going to have the probiotic benefits. But I mean, both are good and good for you.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with everything you just said. I mean, I would just point out that, like, you know, okay, so here I'm making bread today. So this is my bread that's rising. Now, you know, if I wanted the probiotics from the sourdough, I would just pinch off a little bit of that and eat it. But, like, I'm not at all drawn to eating raw bread. So, I mean, not every fermented food really lends itself that well to eating raw. So, I mean, you know, later this afternoon, I'm going to, you know, put this in the oven and, you know, have a loaf of bread, and I'll enjoy that over the coming days as a cooked food that doesn't have live cultures. But, you know, the flavor, the nutrient bioavailability, the lightness and texture, you know, I mean, the fermentation is giving it all of these advantages, even if I'm not getting the live culture benefit. Now, if you take something like sauerkraut, now, I mean, that's raw. I mostly eat it raw, but, like, oh my God, I love to make sauerkraut soup, and once in a while I'll make sauerkraut pierogies. In my new book, I have a recipe for sauerkraut cake. You know, there's all kinds of ways you can cook it, and, you know, I'm with Julia. Like, you know, you want to eat a little bit of it raw, but, like, there's nothing wrong with cooking it. Now, you know, the practice that I would have a bit of a critique of is, like, you know, the standard American way of producing sauerkraut, where you know, ferment your sauerkraut in a crock, and then you put it all in canning jars, and then you heat process it so that it can just sort of sit in the jar indefinitely. And I think that, you know, I mean, there are trade-offs. I mean, it could be nice to have something that sits around indefinitely, but, like, I think that it's really a shame to, you know, kill all of the sauerkraut. I mean, you know, cook what you want to cook, but, like, you know, eat some of it raw, because the probiotic benefits, you know, really are, you know, important and can be profound. The one other thing I want to say is that there is this sort of emerging idea. So there's probiotics. I'm sure many of you have heard about prebiotics. Prebiotics are, you know, basically fibers, polysaccharides, you know, basically, you know, foods with nutritional components that, you know, our bodies can't easily break down, and they basically feed the bacteria along the entire length of our digestive system. And, you know, we all need more fiber, and, you know, eating fibrous food is good. Like, we all eat much less fiber than our ancestors did, and we are suffering for it. So I think we all need prebiotics, like more, you know, fiber food that feeds the bacteria along the entire length of our digestive system. But there's this emergent concept of postbiotics. And, I mean, bacteria are so, bacteria are so incredible. And by the way, I keep forgetting to show off my t-shirt. Bacteria, prokaryotic cells, are one of the things that defines them is that their genetic material is free floating in the cell rather than contained in a nucleus like an ours. And one of the superpowers that bacteria have, compared to us, like we have a set of genetics, for better and for worse, that we're working with for the entirety of our lives, and things affect it. There's this whole field of epigenetics that focuses on how environmental factors influence the expression of genes. Obviously, we don't understand it all. We are learning more and more about the dynamics of how genes work. But bacteria are not genetically stable. Bacteria have all these mechanisms by which they can exchange genetic material, pick up genetic material from the environment, get rid of genetics that's no longer relevant. So the current thinking, or the emergent thinking, is that to some degree, living bacteria can pick up genetic material from bacteria that have died and work with it. So, it is possible that there could be some, postbiotic benefit from eating, even bacteria that have been, killed by heat.
And I think when you talked about the prebiotic and probiotic too, I mean, I think it's also important to note that so many of these traditional foods like sauerkraut are both. They do have that fiber, and they do also have the probiotics in them.
And I think Raju asked a follow-up question. I can't eat raw food much. Was curious, but also about your last part about storing and keeping ferment is what I was thinking of too. I mean, the elegant thing about how fermented foods work is that, obviously, like a living food, you can't just store it at any temperature forever, but you can store it for a very long time at a low temperature, much shorter times than a warm temperature. But places that have warm temperatures typically do not have a lack of fresh plant food. It's places that are low temperature that tend to have long periods where there's no fresh plant food. So, in the places where there's a greater necessity to store food for longer periods of time, you can do it because the temperatures are lower. In places that are warmer, there's greater limitations on how long you can store fermented foods, but that's okay because you're not as reliant on those foods to, get you through a long, harsh winter. And of course, anyone with a computer to be tuning into this is also going to have a fermentation slowing device in their kitchen, which is a refrigerator. And so, you can, the refrigerator slows down the metabolism of all these organisms by being at a lower temperature. So, you make a few jars, store them in the fridge, eat them, and then when you're getting to the end of those, make a few more jars. You don't have to do this on a vast scale and produce enough to, get you through for a year or some years.
Yeah. No, I agree. I make some of the most interesting ferments I make at a pretty small scale. When I make mead or something, I make, like a gallon or two. I'm not making enough to feed an army necessarily. Does anybody else have any more questions right now?
Julia, what are you making in your kitchen these days? You got any interesting ferments going?
So I'm actually in my bedroom. My kitchen is way too much of a mess to be on film right now. So I'm away from my kitchen at the moment. But so I actually just made a bunch of sauerkraut and pausai, using some of the brine from the pausai that you made in our event in 2020, right before everything shut down. We all did a workshop together. But I'm preparing for an artist residency where I'm going to go make ferments and write and kind of just hang out in a cabin in the woods by myself for a week, which is going to be great. And so I'm bringing a bunch of ferments with me, both for me to eat and for me to share with the other residents and with the chef that's there. So, yeah, lots of different kinds of sauerkraut, a vegan kimchi, that pausai, and like several gallons of beet kvass. One of my favorite ones.
Let's tell people what beet kvass is, because some people tuned in might not be aware of beet kvass, but that's like a vegetable ferment you can drink instead of eat.
Yeah, that's like, if you're somebody that likes drinking pickle brine, you will probably love beet kvass. It's like, it's a little bit sour. It's like a nice, just beet fermented, lacto-fermented beet beverage. You just cut up beets, you put them in brine, you let it, and you put a decent number of beets in there so that you really get a lot of that good color and flavor in. This batch, I also put celery root and horseradish, and carrot, I think, too. And you let it go for a few days, strain it out. You can bottle it, drink it. I love beet kvass. It's really good. How do you ever add any other flavors to yours? Do you add horseradish or anything like that when you make it?
Oh yeah. I was just going to say that in Fermentation Journeys, I have a recipe for a beet kvass with horseradish, ginger, and garlic that I learned about from some people I met, Jen and Jordan, who have a fermentation business in Cincinnati, Stab Ferment, and they make a flavor of beet kvass with those ingredients that they call Bubonic Tonic. And we've been at some of the same conferences, and whenever I run into them at these conferences, I'm like, oh my God, give me some Bubonic Tonic. And so they were kind enough to share the recipe in my book. I see that Jen Thompson, who was a student at my most recent residency, is making a gallon of mead today, and I've been really enjoying. She makes flavored meads, and then the solids that she strains out, she dehydrates. So this is, I've been loving this. I've been eating this and using it as an ingredient in salad dressing specifically, but it's dehydrated lemon, ginger, honey. So it's basically the solids from her mead that she strained out and then dehydrated and powdered, and it's very, it's sweet. It's got some flavor of mead, and definitely the lemon and ginger are very, very pronounced in there. So, I think that, there's a lot you can do with the byproduct. I mean, I see Kyle Taborski is talking about making sake, and I've been making a lot of sake, and then I mentioned the Chinese style meiju, and I have recipes for both in Fermentation Journeys. But the rice mostly decomposes, but you do end up with solid residue that you strain and press out. I use these little sort of like fine mesh nylon bags that I first strain it through, and then I squeeze them and press as much liquid out as I can. But that residue that in Japanese cuisine is known as katsu has so many applications. I mean, I just can't believe how delicious it is and how many different things you can do with it. I mean, I'm not using it in this particular batch of bread, but you can rise bread with it. Like, you can mix it with, water and wheat flour, leave out the yeast, leave out the sourdough. The katsu has plenty of rising power to rise a loaf of bread. It's got beautiful flavor. I've been doing a lot of scrambled eggs, where I scramble a little bit of the katsu in it, and it gives it like this elusive cheesiness.
That sounds
I've just been incorporating the katsu in all kinds of things, for its flavor, for its rising power. I make beautiful crackers with it. Very, very versatile. But I think that all of the not all, but so many of the byproducts of fermentation, you can do other things with it. like my big batch of radish kraut, this is from a couple of gallons of radish kraut. This is the extra juice, and I'm just drinking it. But, by the time I get to the bottom of my, 50 gallons of radish kraut, I'll end up with 5 gallons to 10 gallons of juice. And, honestly, that's more than I can drink. So, in the book, I actually have a write-up of techniques for dehydrating it into crystal salts that have that are salty, but with the flavor of the brine, which is a little bit technically challenging, but much easier is to concentrate it. This is what I call eau de kraut. And it's cooked down about 10 to 1. I save a little bit of it raw. So after I cook it down and cool it off, I add a little bit raw, so there is a probiotic aspect to it. But this is, this is more acidic than vinegar, and it's as salty as soy sauce. So I've just been using this as a as a seasoning and a condiment, and it's really wonderful. And you're a person who's always not have food waste, not generate food waste, and what you remove from one process, you want to figure out how to put into another process. I think that a lot of the byproducts of fermentation just have an incredible amount of flavor that we can make use of in other applications.
Mm-hmm. Well, and flavors that I think we're maybe not getting from the other ingredients we're putting in our food. When I make, I'll cook down a whole chicken in a crock pot or something to make soup, and I'll always add in vinegar, which both helps kind of release the collagen from the chicken and makes for a richer broth, but also adds a nice flavor, it makes it taste better. And I'll do that sometimes with my pickle brines and things like that too. I mean, pickle brine is a wonderful, versatile marinade. I mean, I use pickle brine, to the point, I use it so much in my cooking that sometimes, I have to make more pickles just to have enough brine. And I make a lot of pickles, so. But, it's, 1,001 uses. And I love your idea of making the eau de kraut and having it really cooked down like that. That's a great idea.
So there's a couple of other questions here. I just lost the, okay. Kyle Taborski said, speaking of mead, when I make that, wine, or sake, it is very yeasty. I know racking can reduce the yeasty flavor of mead and wine, but I want to drink sake immediately. What can I do about the yeasty flavor, or is that the way these beverages should taste? And industrial processes change their flavor. Do you have any thoughts about that, or?
I haven't made sake a ton. So if you have an answer ready to go, it's probably going to be better than mine on this particular topic.
So, I think to me it's interesting, this whole question of what beverages should taste like. So I'll tell you that to me the sake that I make doesn't taste excessively yeasty at all. I actually love it. Some people who've tried it have felt like it was more acidic than they like, and definitely acidity is part of making sake. Sake involves not only yeast but lactic bacteria. But my perspective would be, until the 20th century, when commercial pure yeast became available, all alcoholic beverages that involve yeast also involve lactic acid bacteria. And so, I'm very drawn to this contemporary movement of sour beers. I love the flavor of the sour beer. And once when I was visiting my dad, who lives in the Hudson Valley of New York, and he's really doing pretty great at age 87, and we stopped at I asked him to make a stop at a store that had a wide variety of beers, because I don't like to drink the beers that he likes, and he was a little bit mortified that I spent like $10 for a 6-pack of beer, and then it was a sour beer, and he'd never heard of such a thing. And so like that evening when I sort of opened one of the beers and poured it for myself, he wanted to have a taste of it, and he took a taste, and he just made the most horrified taste. Like, I can't believe my son wants to drink something that tastes like that. But I think that, our tastes get formed by our experience. And so, if, in the entire 20th century, there was like a narrowing of the range of what beer should taste like, then, sort of sour beer, people might think of it as a new thing, but really I would say until the 20th century, probably pretty much all beer was sour beer, because there's no way to get yeast without also getting lactic bacteria. I just think it's interesting, and I mean, my approach is just to try to always broaden my palate and accept different things. Now, I mean, in terms of the yeastiness of the sake, I never add yeast to anything. I'm sort of working with natural yeast, which are probably in lower concentrations than if you add a packet of yeast to start something. So, the Bodai Moto method of making sake, which is the one that I feature in the Art of Fermentation, basically you make the moto, the starter, when you take a couple of quarts of water and you add like a pound of rice raw in a little mesh bag. That's the source of the yeast and bacteria. And then you take a pound of rice and you cook it, and then you put that in, and that's the source of the nutrients. And so, the organisms that are present on the raw rice, consuming the nutrients that become available by virtue of cooking the other rice. And then after a few days, the whole thing is nice and bubbly and active. And that's a combination of yeast and lactic bacteria. And then at that point, I take my rice koji and I add that. But I take the mesh bag with the raw rice out, drain as much of the liquid off it as I can, cook that, and then I add that rice back in. But so really the only ingredients are rice and water, part of the rice being koji, rice that I've grown this fungus, Aspergillus oryzae. So that sake is not excessively yeasty to me, but sometimes when I've tried beverages, any of the different kinds of fermented beverages that people have started with like a packet of yeast, they're just starting with such a concentration of yeast that, sometimes it gives it a yeasty flavor. I don't think that's a bad thing. It's maybe just the nature of, using such a concentration of yeast to start things. But I don't even know if that's the story of what you made. But, I would worry less about how things should taste and how you like them. And so, if you find that to be too yeasty, then, maybe try a style that doesn't involve adding pure culture yeast. Or if you want to use pure culture yeast, maybe try adding less of it.
Yeah, I always tell my students as well, like, what matters most is that you make ferments you want to eat. Like whether or not it tastes right, or something I want to eat, that doesn't matter. It matters that you want to be eating it because you're the one that has to.
And then Kyle is saying that the sake was from my book. So okay, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe try fermenting it a little bit longer. I mean, my book's only been out in the winter months, and depending on the temperature of your kitchen, maybe it needs a little bit more time for all the sugars to break down into alcohol, and for the sort of for the yeast population to start diminishing. So time can time is obviously the most important variable in fermentation.
Do we have any? You said there was another question out there too, right?
Oh, okay. Here, there's one unanswered questions. I'm wondering which books, classes, resources you would most recommend for beginners? I've made a lot of kombucha, but just getting started with other ferments. Kaylin. Well, you know, we are in a time that is rich with fermentation resources. And Julia, why don't you start and maybe offer a few of your favorites?
Yeah. One of the books I found really helpful when I was first starting out was actually Wild Fermentation. I like Art of Fermentation a lot too. I got into that one later. I think as far as just here's some straightforward recipes to try, I think Wild Fermentation is really good for that. That one right there. I mean, if you're feeling intimidated about different processes, or you feel like there's steps that you're maybe not understanding, I would encourage you to actually learn from somebody in a workshop, or, have a friend over who makes it and have them show you. When I first learned to make sauerkraut, it was actually for the same reason as Sandor's, that I had a garden and I had all these cabbages and all these other vegetables that suddenly were all ready to go at once, and I had to figure out how to make things with them very quickly. And so I didn't know how to make sauerkraut. One of my friends who grew up on a farm came over and showed me, and that's kind of how my journey began. But having her show me was helpful because it was before we were at a time where you had, all these videos, books, all these different things. But yeah, Wild Fermentation would be probably my first recommendation. And then just fermenting with people and learning, kind of hands-on learning with people, is really helpful too.
Well, I'm not going to argue with that. No, I mean, I think that, I guess Wild Fermentation is the book that I would recommend as a first book for learning about fermentation. But there are a lot of other introduction to fermentation books available, and especially if there's a particular realm of fermentation you're interested in. Like, if you wanted to really dive deep into specifically fermenting vegetables, Kirsten and Christopher Shockey's book, Fermenting Vegetables, is a wonderful resource that really goes vegetable by vegetable and, sort of gives ideas for how to use them. If you're interested in diving into the world of making cheese, I love David Asher's book, The Art of Natural Cheese Making, but there's also many other wonderful cheese making books. Like if you're interested in going down the rabbit hole of Koji, this incredible book, Koji Alchemy, by Jeremy Umansky and Rich Shih, really just blew my mind with the innovative applications of Koji that they worked out. So there's lots of literature, but I think, I really agree with Julia that, a book can only teach you so much. A book can give you some basic information, but, fermentation is experiential learning. It's you have to just try things and you'll make mistakes. Hopefully you can bring an analytical approach and figure out what you could have done to have results that would be more pleasing to you. Some people have a hard time learning from reading through a book, and it's incredible. YouTube. Just for anything. For fixing your washing machine or anything, but certainly in the realm of cooking and food preparation. People are making all kinds of videos. So sometimes just seeing someone do something makes all the difference. But I think that. My perspective on this idea that fermentation, is this sort of hot new food trend is, that's ridiculous. The products of fermentation have really enjoyed enduring popularity. And it's just that, in our grandparents' time, people were eating and drinking them, but maybe they weren't thinking about them that much. And you know, they were just like, you know, they were just the landscape. They were just the wallpaper. They were just like, they're so integral to food traditions everywhere that, you know, you don't have to be aware of them. You don't have to think about them. But I think it's exciting that so many people are thinking about it. And, you know, the fact that so many people are thinking about it means that more people are writing about it, more people are making videos about it, more people are, you know, organizing workshops about it. So, you know, there's just, you know, an incredible cornucopia of things to learn about. And of course, that can be confusing because, you know, there's so many books, there's so many workshops. Where do I start? But, you know, you just have to start somewhere.
Yeah. I think
we're getting to the end, and I know that ER wanted to be sure to be brought back in. So, ER, if you're listening, maybe this would be a good time to come back.
Oh. Yeah, thank you both so much. This was like beautiful and full of so much great information. So I hope folks are feeling inspired to start getting ready on your own kitchens. I know it's snowy on a lot of the East Coast right now, so it's a good day to maybe bubble up some warm things. And I want to encourage folks, if you click this teal button at the bottom center of your screen, that will take you to all of the books. So all of Sandor's books, all of Julia's books, including the Hidden Cosmos deck. And you can also pre-order Julia's next book, which does come out in the summer. So go ahead and pre-order that book, because it really does help authors when you order their books ahead of time. It shows the publisher, especially right now with supply chain stuff and everything, it tells them how many to print. So it helps her, it helps everybody all down the supply chain to know, oh, there's a lot of demand for this book. So if you think you might want to buy it, go ahead and do it now. We'll ship it to you the day it comes out. And it really does help everybody. The other thing, just to remind you, is to encourage your local public library to carry these books. So totally fine if you can't afford to buy them. It's a great thing to just let your public library know, hey, can you carry this in your cookbook section? Because sometimes they don't know there's an interest. So if you can put that out there, it really does help. And that way more people can get to know about fermentation. So thank you both so much for being with us. This was a really fun day.
Can I just take two minutes to answer Paul Cash's question from Australia?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, you know, it's such an honor that people from like so far away are tuned into this. You know, I know that there's huge interest in fermentation in Australia. I've had the opportunity to travel down there twice to teach, and I was actually in Australia when the pandemic started. But tips on Koji equipment. So that's the challenging thing about Koji, is you've got to figure out a way to maintain a temperature between, you know, roughly 80 degrees and 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be about 28 to 32 Celsius. And you know, the first time I made a Koji, I used an oven with a pilot light as my place, and I had to prop it open a little bit to keep the temperature low enough. In recent years, what I've been using is a defunct refrigerator. So it basically is functioning as an insulated box. And then my source of heat is an old style incandescent light bulb on a simple clip light fixture. And then the key is a temperature controller. You know, the brand that's making really accessible ones on the internet is called Inkberg. And it's basically like you set your target temperature and plug something and plug it into the wall, and then you plug into that either something for heating if your ambient temperature is likely to be lower than your target, or potentially like an air conditioner or something in a cooling one. With the light bulb, I plug it into the heating one, and every time the temperature gets lower than the target up there where the thermometer is, it turns on the light bulb. And as soon as the temperature reaches the target, it turns off the light bulb. So, you know, that's what I do. And I do it in wooden trays, but, you know, for your first batch, you don't need a wooden tray. I mean, just use a tray that's in your kitchen, a glass tray or a metal tray, and then just use a cloth to line it. Like, the problem with like metal or glass for making Koji is condensation at the edges. So just use a clean lint-free cloth to line it, and then that'll take care of any condensation. I can't recommend the book Koji Alchemy highly enough. They have like lots of ideas for how to do it, you know, some of which really defy the traditional Japanese ways, but that can make it really technically easy in a modern kitchen.
Wonderful. I'm putting a link to Koji Alchemy in the chat. Unfortunately, we do not ship to Australia, so we are not going to be very helpful to you, Polycash, but to anyone who is in the United States and wants to check out that book, please do. And thank you all for watching from around the world. That's always really exciting to us. So great to be with an international audience today. Thank you both, Sandor, Julia, for your time. Congratulations on your beautiful new works, and I hope that you stay safe and well in our ongoing pandemic. Take care of yourselves, and we hope to get to see you in person sometime soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ER.
Take care.
I love Charis books. Thanks for making this happen.
Yeah, we appreciate you. Bye-bye.
Bye.